Gladys had always believed that her life was nothing short of perfect. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, preparing breakfast while humming softly to herself, believing that love and loyalty were constants in her marriage. Robert, her husband of 7 years, was the kind of man people admired, a successful businessman with a magnetic charm and a disarming smile that won over even the coldest hearts. To everyone on the outside, they appeared to be the perfect couple. She, the supportive, gentle wife, and he, the adoring husband who seemed to have eyes only for her. But deep beneath Gladys's contentment lingered an unexplainable unease, like the distant murmur of a storm brewing on the horizon. Robert had become increasingly distracted lately, often stepping away to take private calls or returning home later than usual, brushing off her concerns with a casual, "Work's been crazy, sweetheart." One evening, as they sat at their dining table surrounded by the soft glow of the chandelier, Gladys found herself studying Robert more closely. His laughter was hollow, his gaze flickering over her without truly seeing her. "Robert, is everything all right?" she asked gently, her voice tinged with uncertainty. He looked up briefly, forcing a smile. "You worry too much, Gladys. I'm just tired, that's all." But her heart whispered otherwise. Still, she dismissed her feelings, unwilling to shatter the illusion of the life they'd built. She had sacrificed so much to uphold the image of a dutiful wife, believing love was enough to keep the cracks at bay. Little did she know, behind Robert's practiced smile lay secrets darker than she could fathom, secrets that would soon dismantle everything she thought she knew about marriage, loyalty, and trust. The subtle cracks in Gladys's world widened when she began noticing hushed tones and lingering glances exchanged between Robert and her close friend, Gloria. It started as a faint suspicion, one she desperately tried to silence. After all, Gloria had been by her side for years, almost like a sister. But as days passed, the whispered phone calls and the way conversations abruptly ended when she walked into the room gnawed at her peace. One afternoon, as she cleared the dishes from their living room, she heard Robert's voice low and urgent behind the door to his study. "No, she has no idea," he murmured, followed by a breathy laugh. Gladys paused, her hand tightening around the plate in her grasp, straining to catch more, but silence quickly fell. When she gently pushed open the door, Robert stood by the window, phone tucked away, flashing her that same smile she once found reassuring. "Everything okay?" she asked lightly, masking the tremble in her voice. He shrugged casually, slipping past her. "Just business. You know how it is." Gloria's name wasn't mentioned, but something about the secrecy unsettled her. That evening, Gladys invited Gloria over, hoping to ease the discomfort swirling inside her. But the moment Gloria walked in, her eyes darted nervously around the house, and her conversation felt forced, stilted. "Is Robert around?" Gloria asked nonchalantly, feigning interest in mundane things while sneaking glances toward the hallway. Gladys's heart clenched. She smiled through the evening, forcing herself to believe she was imagining things. Yet, as she lay in bed later, Robert beside her already asleep or pretending to be, the echoes of hushed voices replayed in her mind. The certainty she once felt in her marriage had begun to crumble quietly, leaving behind a gnawing void she couldn't ignore. Weeks turned into restless nights, and Gladys's unease grew unbearable. One rainy afternoon, she decided to tidy up Robert's study, something she rarely did. As she gathered papers scattered across his desk, her eyes caught sight of his phone, left carelessly unlocked. She hesitated, heart pounding, before curiosity overtook her. Scrolling through his messages, her breath hitched when she stumbled upon a string of chats with Gloria, intimate, flirtatious, and far from innocent. Words like, "Can't wait to see you tonight," and "She suspects nothing," flashed before her eyes, each message cutting deeper than the last. Gladys's hands trembled violently, her vision blurring as her entire reality shifted. For a moment, she stood frozen, trying to steady her breathing, her heart breaking silently in that room filled with betrayal. That evening, she confronted Robert, struggling to keep her composure. "Robert," she began softly, meeting his eyes across the living room, "I came across your messages with Gloria." For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps guilt, but it vanished just as quickly. He chuckled, shaking his head dismissively. "You're overthinking again, Gladys. Gloria and I are just friends. Don't read too much into harmless jokes." His words were smooth, calculated, designed to make her question her sanity. "You're imagining things because you're too sensitive," he added, wrapping an arm around her shoulder like nothing was amiss. Gladys wanted to scream, to break free from the gaslighting, but the years of trusting him, of giving her all to this marriage, left her paralyzed. Alone in their bedroom later that night, she stared blankly at the ceiling, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, wondering how long she had been living in a carefully constructed lie. Days stretched into weeks, and though Gladys tried to carry on, Robert's sudden shift from dismissive to unnervingly affectionate unsettled her. One evening after dinner, he surprised her with an unexpected proposal. "How about we take a little trip, just the two of us?" he asked, his voice unusually warm, eyes devoid of the cold distance she'd grown used to. "A weekend getaway. You've been stressed. Let's get away from everything." The offer was so sudden, so unlike him, that it made her hesitate. Yet, deep inside, she clung to the dwindling hope that perhaps he truly wanted to fix their marriage. Against her instincts, she agreed. The next morning, he whisked her away in his car, driving further and further out of town. The roads became narrower, less familiar, until they reached a house she had never seen before. A dilapidated, isolated structure sitting eerily alone amidst a thick line of trees. "This is it," he announced, parking the car, his smile tight. Gladys stepped out hesitantly, glancing around. The house felt cold, abandoned, its windows covered in dust, the silence pressing in on her ears. "Robert, are you sure about this place?" she asked softly, her voice edged with unease. "Trust me," he replied, unlocking the front door with a key she never knew he had. Inside, the room smelled of decay and disuse. No cozy getaway furniture, no prepared meals, just empty, lifeless space. Robert excused himself, saying he needed to get supplies from town and would be back shortly. She watched him drive off, standing alone at the doorstep. Hours passed, shadows stretched long across the floor, and the sky darkened. Gladys's phone, conveniently left at home at Robert's insistence, left her completely cut off. As night descended, a creeping dread settled in her chest. Something about this house felt wrong, but it wasn't until the next morning, when she found every door locked from the outside, that the horrifying reality began to sink in. Gladys's knuckles bruised as she pounded against the doors, shouting Robert's name, but no sound returned except her echo. She tried every window, every latch, everything was sealed. Panic clawed at her throat as the weight of the betrayal bore down. Had he truly left her here? Abandoned her in this desolate place like she meant nothing? Her thoughts spun, each possibility darker than the last. Hours stretched by without food or water, and a cold chill clung to her skin. Her mind kept replaying snippets of conversations, Gloria's forced smiles, Robert's sudden affection, the hollow look in his eyes when he assured her he'd return. She sank to the floor, the dust biting at her lungs, realization slamming harder with each passing second. He wasn't coming back. No one knew where she was, and she had no way out. Despair wrapped its fingers around her, and memories flooded her aching mind. The laughter she shared with Gloria, how she once clung to Robert's words like lifelines. Now those same people had left her to rot. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room, tears tracing down her dirt-streaked face. "What did I ever do to deserve this?" Hours turned into a restless night, shadows dancing eerily across the cracked walls. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but worse was the thirst that parched her throat, her lips cracked and dry. The darkness felt suffocating, the air thick with the betrayal that had poisoned her life. Her heart, once fragile but full of love, now splintered into jagged pieces. As dawn teased faint rays through the dirty windows, she stood weakly, determined not to let herself crumble completely. But deep inside, she feared she wouldn't last another day. Hope was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. By the second day, the walls felt as though they were closing in, each hour blurring into the next. Gladys's body grew weaker, her knees buckling from exhaustion and dehydration. She searched the house for anything at all, but it was as if Robert had meticulously stripped it bare, ensuring she wouldn't survive long enough to escape. Dust filled her lungs, and the once faint sound of the wind scraping against the old wooden frames felt deafening in her isolation. Her throat burned as she whispered broken prayers, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness. She pictured Robert's face, the man she loved, realizing now how cold and calculated his betrayal truly was. Tears no longer came, even they had dried up, leaving her hollow. In moments of lucidity, her mind swirled with painful questions. How had she not seen the warning signs sooner? Had Gloria smiled at her all those years while secretly plotting with Robert? Weakly, she leaned against the cracked wall, her heartbeat faint, and whispered, "I don't want to die here." But her voice felt like it vanished into the void. The house stood silent, indifferent to her suffering. With each passing minute, her vision blurred, muscles aching from the effort to stay upright. She wondered if anyone would ever find her. Her family, distant and out of reach, had no idea where she was. The woman who once hosted lively dinners, who had loved unconditionally, now lay on the cold, hard floor of an abandoned house, discarded like nothing. Slowly, the shadows crept longer, and darkness overtook her again, her body teetering between life and the brink of surrender. Reuben had always preferred the quiet roads away from the chaos of the city. On that particular afternoon, he drove alone, his mind heavy with memories and regrets he couldn't shake. The winding country lanes gave him temporary solace, the kind that no amount of wealth or power ever could. As he passed a weathered fence and the silhouette of a crumbling house came into view, something tugged at him. He slowed the car instinctively, a strange feeling gnawing at his chest. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time. Yet, as he glanced through the broken window, something or someone caught his attention. Stepping out, he cautiously approached the structure, hearing the faintest of sounds, like a whisper fighting against the wind. "Is someone in there?" he called out, voice firm but laced with concern. Inside, Gladys stirred faintly, unsure if she was hallucinating. Her lips were too dry to form proper words, but she pushed herself weakly toward the noise. Reuben squinted, his pulse quickening when he caught sight of a frail figure collapsing near the doorway. Without hesitation, he forced the lock, the creaking door giving way beneath his strength. "Miss, can you hear me?" he asked, kneeling beside her. Gladys's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting but producing no sound. Reuben gently gathered her into his arms, shocked at how cold and light she felt. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. "Hang in there," he murmured, carrying her swiftly to his car. The urgency in his chest felt unfamiliar, but something about her, her vulnerability, her face, stirred something deep within him, something protective he hadn't felt in years. Reuben drove fast, his usual calculated demeanor replaced by raw urgency. As the car sped toward his estate on the outskirts of town, he glanced repeatedly at the fragile woman beside him. She drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of her surroundings. "Stay with me," he urged under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Upon reaching the gates of his grand estate, he barked orders at his staff, his voice sharp with uncharacteristic emotion. "Prepare a room immediately, call the doctor, and bring water now." His housekeeper, Favor, stared at him wide-eyed, unused to seeing Reuben so unsettled. Without waiting, Reuben carried Gladys upstairs himself, gently laying her on the bed as the physician was summoned. Hours later, the doctor confirmed she was dehydrated, malnourished, and emotionally drained but stable. Still, Reuben remained by her bedside, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Favor entered quietly with a bowl of broth. "Who is she, sir?" she asked softly, noticing the strange protectiveness in Reuben's eyes. He shook his head. "I don't know yet," he replied, voice low. Gladys stirred faintly, her cracked lips parting. Her first words barely registered, a faint, hoarse whisper. "Where am I?" Reuben leaned in. "You're safe now," he assured her gently, his voice softening. "Rest. You've been through enough." As she drifted back to sleep, he sat back, feeling an odd sense of responsibility take root. Unsure why fate had placed this broken woman in his path, but certain he wouldn't let her fall again. Days turned into a slow rhythm of quiet recovery. Gladys remained weak but conscious, sipping water and small portions of soup under Favor's attentive care. Reuben visited frequently, far more often than necessary, always bringing a calm, almost fatherly presence to the room. He avoided pressing her for details, respecting the clouded pain in her eyes. Yet every time she glanced at him, she couldn't help but notice something odd, the way he looked at her, like he recognized something in her face he couldn't quite name. Between spoonfuls of soup, she dared to ask one afternoon, her voice still fragile. "Why did you stop that day? Why did you help me?" Reuben paused, his gaze resting thoughtfully on her. "I don't believe in coincidences," he replied softly, folding his arms. "There was something about you, something familiar." His words sent a strange chill down Gladys's spine. As she healed, her mind wandered, not just about Robert's betrayal, but why this stranger seemed so invested in her well-being. She wanted to trust him. After all, he had saved her life. But there was an intensity in his protectiveness that puzzled her. At night, she found herself staring out the large window of the guest room, wondering not only about the man who left her to die, but about the man who brought her back to life. The question lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Who exactly was Reuben, and why did she feel like she had known him long before he ever found her? As the days grew quieter, Gladys found herself reflecting on fragments of her past she hadn't thought about in years. One afternoon, while sunlight streamed softly through the tall windows of Reuben's estate, she sat on the edge of the bed, fingers lightly tracing the hem of her sleeve. The silence of the house reminded her of her mother, her gentle voice, the distant sadness in her eyes. There had always been something enigmatic about her mother, something she never fully understood. Gladys had been young when she passed, the cause never openly discussed within the family. She closed her eyes, remembering how her mother often sat by the window, staring out at something invisible, lost in thought. "You're too much like her," relatives used to whisper. But those words carried weight she never questioned, until now. Later that evening, she summoned the courage to ask Reuben a question that had lingered in the back of her mind. "Did you ever know a woman named Margaret?" she asked quietly, naming her mother. Reuben, who had been reading in the armchair beside her bed, stilled. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, a flash of recognition perhaps, but it vanished before she could be certain. He cleared his throat, setting the book aside. "The name sounds familiar," he answered carefully, though his tone grew softer. "But I've known many people over the years." Gladys nodded slowly, unsure whether to press further. Something about the way he looked away, the slight tension in his jaw, left her with the unsettling feeling that there were more layers to her mother's past, and perhaps to Reuben himself, than anyone had ever told her. Back in the city, the atmosphere inside Robert's penthouse was starkly different. The soft clink of glasses echoed as he poured champagne into 2 flutes, handing one to Gloria, who lounged smugly on the velvet sofa. "To freedom," Robert toasted, his smile smug and cold. Gloria's laugh was sharp, her eyes gleaming with a satisfaction she no longer bothered to hide. "I still can't believe she's out of the picture. It worked even better than we planned," she purred, sipping her drink. Robert leaned back, letting out a satisfied sigh. "No one's asking questions, no police. No calls, it's like she vanished." They both laughed, intoxicated by their own cruelty, oblivious to the cracks beginning to form beneath their feet. However, beneath Gloria's bravado, a flicker of unease began to settle. "You're sure no one saw you out there?" she asked, lowering her voice. Robert waved off her concern, rolling his eyes. "Relax, Gloria. That place was in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no cameras. She's gone, and so is the problem." But in the back of her mind, an unsettling image of Gladys's face the last time she saw her haunted her. As much as she wanted to believe they'd gotten away clean, something gnawed at her, an uneasy sense that unfinished business never stays buried for long. Yet for now, they drank and celebrated, convinced they had severed the final tie standing between them and everything they desired. Night after night, as her strength returned, Gladys found herself lying awake beneath the heavy quilt, staring at the intricate patterns on the ceiling of Reuben's estate. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that kept her restless. It was the storm of thoughts that refused to quiet. She replayed every betrayal, every lie Robert fed her, every mocking glance from Gloria. A time came when sorrow no longer drowned her. It simmered, hardening into something sharper, clearer. She no longer wanted answers from Robert or explanations from Gloria. What she wanted now was control, to reclaim the parts of herself they had tried to strip away. One morning, after Favor helped her dress, she stood before the tall mirror, studying the woman reflected back. "I'm not the same woman you left in that house," she whispered to herself. Downstairs, she found Reuben in the study, engrossed in paperwork. He glanced up as she entered, surprise flashing across his face at how steady she looked. "Gladys," he greeted gently, "you should still be resting." She shook her head, her eyes calm but determined. "I've rested enough," she replied. "I need to think about what comes next." Reuben studied her quietly for a moment, as though trying to decipher the change in her. He didn't press further, but offered a small nod. "Whatever you need, you'll have it." She smiled faintly, her gratitude genuine, but beneath that lay something new, resolve, born from betrayal. She would not be returning to the life she left behind, not as the woman they once controlled. This time, she would move carefully, silently, and when the time came, Robert and Gloria would never see her coming. The air in Reuben's estate always seemed to carry a strange, unspoken heaviness, one that Gladys could never quite place. One afternoon, while Favor busied herself airing out the study, Gladys wandered inside, hoping to distract her restless mind. Her fingers trailed along the mahogany shelves, brushing past rows of old books and antique ornaments. It was then her eyes caught sight of a small leather-bound album, slightly hidden beneath scattered papers. Curiosity overrode hesitation. She gently pulled it free and flipped through the pages. Smiling faces, business gatherings, distant landscapes, all harmless, until she landed on a photograph that made her breath catch. In the faded image, Reuben stood beside a woman unmistakably familiar, her mother, Margaret, much younger, her hand resting delicately on Reuben's arm. They both looked content, maybe even something more. Gladys stared at the photo for several long seconds, her heart pounding in her ears. Why had Reuben never mentioned knowing her mother? The discovery sent a ripple through her chest, a question she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted answered. Later that evening, after dinner, she couldn't contain herself. Walking quietly into the lounge where Reuben was seated by the fireplace, she approached with the photo pressed gently in her hand. "Reuben," she began, voice carefully steady, "I found something today. This photo. You knew my mother, didn't you?" He glanced up, eyes immediately locking onto the image. For a brief moment, something deep and unreadable passed across his face, before he masked it with a small nod. "Yes," he admitted quietly, folding his hands. "We knew each other, but that's a story for another day." His voice was even, but Gladys couldn't shake the sense that the answers she was looking for were buried far deeper than he was willing to share yet. Gloria's laughter had always been sharp, but lately it rang hollow, tinged with something close to dread. Sitting across from Robert at their favorite downtown cafe, she stirred her coffee absently, her gaze flickering to the door every few minutes. "You've been quiet," Robert remarked, arching an eyebrow. She forced a smile, brushing it off. "Just tired." But in truth, Gloria's nerves were fraying. Since the day they left Gladys behind, she'd felt a gnawing anxiety she couldn't shake. Every time the phone rang unexpectedly, every time an unfamiliar number popped up, her stomach twisted. She couldn't help but feel like someone was watching, like shadows clung a little too long. "What if she's not?" she started, but Robert waved her off immediately, his expression hardening. "She's gone," he said sharply, lowering his voice. "Don't start imagining things." But Gloria couldn't silence the unease creeping into her mind. The nightmares had begun subtly at first, Gladys standing silently at the foot of her bed, her eyes hollow. But now they came more frequently, each one more vivid. She avoided mirrors, avoided conversations with friends who casually asked how Gladys was doing. Every reminder felt like a blade pressing to her throat. Alone in her apartment later that night, she scrolled aimlessly through her phone, startled when a text arrived from an unknown number. You can't hide from the truth forever. Her pulse quickened, hands trembling as she stared at the message. Logic told her it was nothing, maybe spam, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Unbeknownst to her, the ghosts she thought she'd buried were slowly stirring. Gladys had grown attuned to the rhythms of Reuben's estate, the quiet footsteps of the staff, the still afternoons, the subtle way Reuben carried himself with effortless control. But lately, she noticed a shift in him. He was more withdrawn, especially when conversation drifted anywhere near her mother or her past. One particular morning, as they sat together in the conservatory, Gladys mentioned offhandedly a childhood memory, how her mother used to braid her hair by the window, humming softly under her breath. She caught the way Reuben's jaw tightened, how his eyes darkened momentarily before he cleared his throat and redirected the topic. "The weather's changing," he remarked casually, glancing out toward the garden, but the warmth in his tone had cooled. Gladys, perceptive by nature, couldn't ignore it anymore. Later that evening, she lingered in the hallway outside his study, listening to the faint murmur of his voice speaking to someone over the phone. The name Margaret drifted past the door, low and weighted. She didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the heaviness in his voice made her pause. When the door finally creaked open, Reuben's eyes met hers, unreadable. "Is everything all right?" she asked carefully, pretending to be passing by. He gave a brief nod, offering her one of those half-smiles she no longer trusted. "Just business matters," he replied, but she knew better. Something about her presence, her memories, was unsettling him, stirring emotions he was working hard to keep buried. And though he never said it aloud, Gladys could feel the undercurrent beneath his steady facade. Reuben was holding on to something, and she was slowly inching closer to the truth. The morning air was crisp as Gladys wandered through the sprawling gardens of Reuben's estate, her thoughts tangled in questions she hadn't yet dared to voice. She found herself near the stables when she noticed a black car rolling up the driveway. Curious, she watched as an elderly man stepped out, adjusting his cap. His posture was familiar, as if he belonged to this place, though she hadn't seen him before. Favor emerged quickly from the side entrance, her smile widening at the sight of the visitor. "Mr. Caleb, it's been so long," she greeted warmly. The old man chuckled, patting her shoulder. "Couldn't stay away forever." Gladys lingered nearby, unnoticed, until the man's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You must be Margaret's daughter," Caleb said suddenly, voice soft but sure. The words hit Gladys like a jolt. She froze, stunned. "Ah, yes, I'm Gladys," she replied cautiously, stepping forward. Caleb's smile faded briefly, as if he realized he had said too much. "Forgive me," he murmured, tipping his hat. "You look so much like your mother. I worked here back then, when she used to visit." Gladys's heart raced. Her mother had been here. She hadn't known that. Before she could press further, Reuben appeared at the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," Reuben greeted stiffly. "Let's catch up inside." Caleb nodded, glancing once more at Gladys with something like regret before disappearing inside with Reuben. Gladys stood rooted in place, her pulse quickening. Each piece of her past seemed to be revealing itself, but never fully, always just out of reach. Across town, Robert sat hunched at his desk, papers scattered, his phone buzzing nonstop. His business, once pristine and enviable, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Investors were pulling out without warning, deals falling apart inexplicably. He slammed his fist against the table, gritting his teeth. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, scrolling through emails filled with bad news. Every financial avenue he turned to seemed to crumble beneath him. Gloria entered the room, her expression tight. "Another partner backed out," she announced, handing him a letter. Robert snatched it, his face reddening as he read. "It's like someone's pulling strings behind the scenes." Gloria sat down opposite him, her nerves fraying visibly. "Do you think this has something to do with her?" she asked cautiously, lowering her voice. Robert shook his head firmly, though doubt flickered behind his eyes. "She's gone," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow, forced. The coincidence gnawed at him, how everything had begun to unravel not long after Gladys vanished. Gloria chewed her lip, clearly unconvinced. "What if someone knows what we did?" she whispered. Robert stood abruptly, pacing. "We covered our tracks. No one knows." Yet deep inside, an unfamiliar fear coiled tight in his chest. For the first time in years, Robert felt something he wasn't used to, losing control. And that terrified him more than he could admit. The days felt longer, heavier, and Gloria couldn't ignore the looming sense that something terrible was coming. Alone in her apartment late one night, she poured herself a drink, her hands trembling. Every corner felt like it held shadows. Every sound outside her window made her flinch. Her phone vibrated and she jumped. Another unknown message lit the screen. "You thought it was over." "It's not." Panic twisted her gut. She downed the drink in one gulp, pacing furiously. She tried calling Robert, but he didn't answer, leaving her to drown in the suffocating silence. Desperation clawed at her as the weight of their shared sin bore down like a storm cloud ready to burst. By morning, she looked haggard, her eyes dark, her mind restless. She met Robert in his office, voice cracking. "I keep getting these texts. I don't know who's sending them, but they know something." Robert dismissed her, too distracted by his collapsing empire. "Ignore them," he snapped, brushing past her. But Gloria grabbed his arm, her composure slipping. "I can't ignore them, Robert. What if she's alive? What if someone knows?" He pulled away coldly, unwilling to face the possibility. Gloria, left standing alone, felt something inside her fracture. The guilt, the paranoia, and the unraveling threads of control had become unbearable. And in the deepest part of her soul, she feared she was being haunted not by a ghost, but by her own choices creeping back to consume her. Gladys found herself restless one quiet afternoon, wandering through Reuben's sprawling estate without aim. The air was heavy with unspoken words, especially after Caleb's visit. Drawn inexplicably to the older sections of the house, she ventured into one of the rarely used storage rooms, where dust danced lazily in the sunlight. She rifled through forgotten boxes filled with old documents, photo albums, and trinkets. It was there she noticed a smaller, weathered wooden chest tucked beneath old fabrics. Curiosity piqued, she knelt down, carefully prying it open. Inside, bundled neatly together, were faded letters tied with delicate silk ribbons. Her fingers trembled as she pulled one free, immediately recognizing her mother's familiar handwriting. The date scrawled in the corner stopped her breath. Letters written long before her mother's death. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the first page. The words spilled emotions she never imagined. Confessions of love, longing, regret, every letter addressed to Reuben. Lines like "I wish circumstances were different," and "if only our paths could truly cross without shadows," leapt out at her. Her mother's voice, so vivid, bared emotions deeper than Gladys ever knew. With each letter, the puzzle sharpened painfully clear. Her mother and Reuben had shared something intimate, something real. She clutched one particular letter to her chest, rereading a passage where her mother spoke cryptically of a child she couldn't fully claim, hinting at a life built on silence and sacrifice. Gladys sat back, her mind spinning, heart thudding wildly. All the pieces were scattering in her hands, and one question screamed louder than the rest. Was everything she believed about her parentage a lie? The following days became unbearable for Gladys, the unanswered questions gnawing at her until she could no longer stand the weight of them. Sitting alone in the guest room, the hidden letters strewn across her lap, her eyes kept returning to one phrase. Our child deserves better, even if she never knows the truth. It felt like an invisible thread was tying her fate to Reuben's more tightly than she ever imagined. She couldn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she made a quiet decision, one rooted in the need to be certain. She contacted a discreet laboratory in the city, arranging for a private DNA test. It was simple enough. Collect a few personal items from Reuben's study, a hair from his comb, a used coffee cup, and send them alongside her own sample. Her hands shook slightly as she sealed the package, her mind torn between dread and anticipation. The next few days stretched unbearably, each moment dragging as she forced herself to act normal around Reuben, swallowing the need to question him outright. Favor noticed her unease, but didn't press, assuming perhaps she was still recovering. Gladys spent sleepless nights walking the halls, playing possible scenarios over and over in her head. She wanted the truth, but part of her feared what it might unravel, not just about her own identity, but why Reuben had kept this secret buried all these years. When the courier finally called to inform her that the results would arrive the next day, her breath caught in her chest. Whether she was ready or not, everything was about to change. That evening, unable to sit idle, Gladys made her way downstairs where Reuben sat alone in his study, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. His usually composed face seemed weighed down, shadows playing across his features. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside, clearing her throat gently. Reuben glanced up, his expression softening, though something flickered behind his eyes. "Gladys," he greeted quietly, setting aside the glass in his hand. For a moment, silence lingered between them, thick and charged. Finally, unable to keep it in any longer, Gladys spoke, voice measured but strained. "Why didn't you ever tell me you knew my mother?" Reuben sighed heavily, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. His shoulders drooped, as though bracing for something inevitable. "Because it wasn't something I thought you needed to carry," he admitted, his voice hoarse. He gestured for her to sit, and after a pause she did, heart pounding. "Your mother and I, we were close. Closer than the world ever allowed us to be." His eyes glistened faintly, the carefully controlled mask slipping. "I loved her, more than I can ever put into words. But circumstances, choices, kept us apart. I didn't know about you, not until it was too late." His voice broke slightly, and Gladys swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "I've spent years wondering if you were." His gaze met hers, raw and filled with something vulnerable. Gladys couldn't bring herself to speak. Her father, her real father, might have been sitting across from her all along, and he hadn't even known. The morning air felt heavier than usual as Gladys sat by her bedroom window, the envelope containing the DNA test results resting in her lap like a loaded weapon. The estate was unusually quiet, but inside her mind a storm raged relentlessly. Her fingers hesitated over the seal, the urge to tear it open battling with the fear of confirmation. Finally, she forced herself to breathe deeply, breaking the envelope open and unfolding the sheet. Her eyes scanned the words rapidly, her vision blurring as the conclusion leapt off the page. A 99% match, Reuben was indeed her biological father. For several minutes she remained frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears. Everything suddenly aligned, the letters, his protectiveness, his deep unease, when she mentioned her mother. It wasn't just coincidence, it was blood. Later that afternoon, she found Reuben in the garden, trimming the roses, the picture of composed solitude. He glanced up as she approached, sensing the weight she carried. She held out the test results without a word. His eyes flicked down to the paper, scanning it quickly. A long silence followed before he finally spoke, voice low and steady. "I suppose part of me always knew," he murmured, setting the clippers aside. Gladys struggled to find her voice, emotions choking her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting years of regret. "Because I thought I lost the right to. I didn't want you burdened with my mistakes." She felt her chest tighten painfully. There were no dramatic tears, no shouts, just the overwhelming weight of a truth long hidden, now laid bare between them. Gladys spent hours walking the corridors of the estate, absorbing the magnitude of her new reality. The betrayal from Robert and Gloria had already shattered her trust, but this revelation cut differently. It wasn't just about deceit, it was about identity, about rediscovering who she truly was. Instead of falling apart, however, something inside her hardened into resolve. She stood before her reflection, taking in the woman she had become, not the naive wife Robert discarded, but a daughter carrying her mother's strength and her father's legacy. For the first time, she realized she didn't need validation from anyone. She had her own power now. That evening, over dinner, Reuben noticed the shift in her demeanor. "You've grown quiet," he remarked, setting down his glass. Gladys met his gaze steadily. "I've been thinking," she said calmly. "Robert and Gloria tried to destroy me, but they underestimated how much strength I have left." Reuben watched her, something like pride glinting in his eyes. "You don't have to go back to that world," he said carefully. "You have a new life here." But Gladys shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I don't intend to go back," she corrected. "I intend to make them pay without them ever seeing it coming." Her voice held a quiet fire now, the spark of someone who had walked through betrayal and emerged unbreakable. She knew she couldn't erase the past, but she could control how this chapter would end. Plans began to form slowly, meticulously. Gladys spent her days gathering information, poring over financial documents Reuben discreetly provided her. Every business connection Robert and Gloria had built was carefully mapped out, and she began to see the cracks she could widen. Over late-night discussions, Reuben assisted her without question, offering resources, access, and contacts. "They believe they've erased you," he said one evening, the two of them seated over documents spread across the table. "Let's use that to our advantage." Gladys nodded, eyes sharp. "I want them to think they've won." Until the ground vanishes beneath their feet. Together, they began pulling strings subtly. Calls were made to investors who had ties to Reuben's empire. Conversations laced with quiet suggestions about Robert's instability. Legal teams reviewed contracts Gloria had manipulated, uncovering discrepancies and liabilities. Every step was deliberate, careful not to reveal Gladys's hand too soon. Meanwhile, she ensured her return remained hidden, operating from the shadows. Favor, ever loyal, aided discreetly, her eyes lighting with approval as she watched Gladys evolve. As weeks passed, the dominoes began lining up perfectly, poised to fall. Gladys felt no haste. She had learned that true revenge required patience, precision, and silence. And when the moment came, it would be devastating. Gloria's once carefully curated world began to crumble in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started subtly, odd calls from banks questioning certain transactions, letters arriving from legal firms she didn't recognize, asking for clarifications on property documents. At first, she dismissed them, brushing them off as minor errors. But as days passed, the pressure intensified. One morning, she stood frozen in front of her apartment door, holding a notice demanding repayment on loans she never recalled signing. Her heartbeat pounded erratically. When she called the financial institutions, the answers were vague, but the message was clear. Something had gone terribly wrong. Sitting across from Robert later that evening, she clutched the notice, her hands visibly trembling. "Something's not right, Robert. Everything's slipping. The banks, the debts, they're piling up." Robert frowned, scanning the papers but offering no reassurance. "It's nothing we can't fix," he said, though his jaw twitched with mounting tension. Gloria leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "What if someone's behind this? What if someone's pulling the strings?" Robert waved her concerns away, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his composure. Gloria's paranoia deepened as she left his office. Every unknown number, every unexpected letter felt like a threat. The confident woman who once stood tall was slowly unraveling, piece by piece, and the worst part was she had no idea who her enemy truly was. Robert paced in his dimly lit office, sweat gathering at his brow as call after call delivered the same bleak news. Partnerships he had secured over years disintegrated within weeks. Major investors pulled out overnight without explanation, key accounts frozen by legal complications he couldn't trace. Every attempt to stabilize the company failed, like sand slipping through clenched fists. He slammed his fist against the desk, the weight of his unraveling empire suffocating. His carefully cultivated control was collapsing, and the irony burned deep. He had no idea who was orchestrating his downfall. Gloria appeared in his office doorway, her face pale, eyes hollow. "I can't keep living like this," she muttered, her voice strained. Robert shot her a look, irritation thinly masking his own fear. "Pull yourself together, Gloria. We've weathered worse." But she shook her head, clutching her coat tighter. "You don't understand. This feels personal." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "What if it's her?" The suggestion made Robert's pulse stutter, but he quickly dismissed it. "Impossible," he snapped, though a flicker of doubt shadowed his expression. Inwardly, he felt the grip of something unfamiliar, vulnerability. The walls were closing in fast, and the world he had so carefully built was crumbling under his feet, leaving him blind to the force orchestrating it all. The day Gladys had envisioned arrived without fanfare. The groundwork had been laid, the final blow ready. Dressed in a sleek, understated suit, she walked into the hotel lobby where Robert and Gloria were scheduled to meet a potential investor, an investor arranged by Reuben, unbeknownst to them. The lobby buzzed with quiet conversation, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of business deals. Robert sat at the far corner, posture rigid, Gloria beside him, her eyes darting nervously. Neither noticed Gladys' approach until she stood right in front of them. The moment stretched long, almost surreal. Robert's face drained of color. Gloria's lips parted in shock. "Hello, Robert," Gladys greeted coolly, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Gloria." For a beat, neither of them spoke, stunned into silence. Gloria's hand trembled against her glass while Robert leaned back, as if needing space to breathe. "How?" Gloria stammered, eyes wide. Gladys smiled faintly. "Did you really think you erased me?" she asked softly, but the steel in her voice was unmistakable. Robert tried to recover, forcing a smirk. "You're alive, impressive, but why show up now?" Gladys leaned forward slightly, her gaze unflinching. "To watch you both fall, and to remind you your games never broke me." With that, she turned on her heel, leaving them stunned, knowing full well the final blow was yet to come. The following week unfolded like a carefully executed checkmate. Gladys, working closely with Ruben's team of discreet attorneys, ensured every piece of evidence, fraudulent transactions, forged signatures, and accounts linking back to Robert and Gloria was perfectly documented. Early one morning, Robert awoke to loud, persistent knocking at his door. Bleary-eyed, he pulled it open to find two uniformed officers standing tall, presenting him with a warrant. "Robert Daniels, you are under investigation for fraud, financial misappropriation, and attempted homicide," one officer stated firmly. His heart stopped, the words reverberating like a cruel echo. Behind them, lawyers arrived, armed with thick files of damning evidence. At the same hour, Gloria faced her own reckoning. As she stepped out of her car, a stern-faced official handed her a court summons. "You've been named in a criminal conspiracy case," he informed her coldly before walking away. Panic flooded her veins. She frantically dialed Robert, but the line remained dead. Back at Ruben's estate, Gladys sat calmly, reading through the official statements, her face unreadable. Later that afternoon, Ruben entered the room, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly. Gladys nodded once, her eyes steady. They'll finally face the consequences they thought they could escape. For her, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her agency, her life, and ensuring justice was served without lifting a single reckless finger herself. In the aftermath of the trial's public exposure, a quiet peace settled over Ruben's estate. News outlets buzzed with reports of Robert and Gloria's downfall. But Gladys deliberately avoided them. One afternoon, she sat beneath the towering oak trees in the garden, feeling the weight she'd carried for so long begin to lighten. Ruben approached, his steps slow but sure, stopping beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then finally, he broke the silence. "I should have told you everything sooner," he admitted softly, his voice tinged with regret. Gladys looked up at him, eyes softening. "You didn't know how. Neither did I," she replied gently. He sat beside her, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows around them. "I missed years I can't get back," he murmured, voice thick. Gladys reached for his hand, giving it a light squeeze. "We can't change the past," she whispered, "but we can decide what we do with the time we have left." Ruben swallowed hard, a faint smile breaking through. There was no need for grand declarations. The bond forming between them was steady, strong, and healing. In the silence that followed, they both felt it. This wasn't the end, but the beginning of something unspoken, something neither betrayal nor distance could break. For once, Gladys felt anchored, grounded by a truth that no one could take away from her again. Weeks later, as spring's first blooms stretched toward the sky, Gladys stood at the front gates of Ruben's estate, gazing out over the horizon. She no longer felt like the broken woman left to die in that deserted house. The scars remained, but they had transformed into a quiet source of strength rather than pain. Ruben walked up behind her, his presence familiar now. "Are you ready?" he asked with a small smile. She nodded, glancing back at the house she now called home. "It's time," she said softly. But this time, she wasn't walking away from something, she was walking toward herself. Later that evening, over a quiet dinner with Favor and Ruben, laughter filled the room, free of heaviness. As the conversation drifted, Ruben raised his glass, his voice filled with sincerity. "To fresh starts," he toasted. Gladys smiled, lifting her own glass. "And to never forgetting who we are." For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not as Robert's discarded wife, not as the woman betrayed, but as Gladys, daughter, survivor, and a woman who had reclaimed her power. The road ahead was hers to write, and as she glanced around at the family she'd gained, she realized she'd finally found peace. The past no longer held her captive. She had stepped fully into her own story, and this was only the beginning. Here's the Bible verse of the story. Though the wicked plot in secret and lay snares in the shadows, the Lord lifts the righteous from the pit and seats them among princes. Betrayal may strike, but restoration is God's final word. Inspired by Psalm 37 verses 12 to 13 and Psalm 113 verses 7 to 8. This verse mirrors Gladys's journey from betrayal and being left to die to her unexpected restoration and discovery of her true worth and identity, reminding readers that even in the darkest schemes of others, divine justice and restoration prevail. Moral of the story, the moral. No betrayal, no loss, and no abandonment can destroy the destiny written for you. Sometimes the people who break you are the very ones who unknowingly lead you to discover your true strength and identity. Justice may take time, but patience, self-worth, and truth always prevail. This moral emphasizes the themes of resilience, hidden identity, justice, and how life's greatest betrayals can become the turning points toward personal empowerment and redemption. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.